Hello and good afternoon, everyone. Making sure we're all here. I'm Audrey Macklin. I'm the director of the Center for Criminology and Sociolegal Studies. Welcome to the 22nd Annual Edwards Lecture, named for the late Professor John Llewellyn J. Edwards, who founded the Center of Criminology in 1964. I'd like to acknowledge the presence of his children today, Justice Mark Edwards and Ms. Alex Stenning, who are here with us. We are honored, really honored to welcome Dean Val Napoleon as our Edwards Lecturer for 2022. And this event today is co-sponsored by Woodsworth College and the Center for Indigenous Studies. I want to begin by acknowledging the land on which the University of Toronto operates. This land is the territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory was the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and Confederacy of the Ojibwe and Allied Nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. Today, this meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island who live here, who lived here before and live here now. We who also live here do so mindful of our responsibility to create and sustain respectful relationships. Now, the words of that land acknowledgement remind us that before and apart from the formation of relationships between settlers and Indigenous people through treaty and otherwise, Indigenous nations governed themselves and their relationships to other Indigenous nations through treaty, covenant, and norms, through Indigenous law. And we're going to hear more about that in a few minutes from Professor Napoleon. Professor John Llewellyn J. Edwards, for whom this lecture is named, wrote and taught about many subjects in his long career, but one of his final contributions was a report to the 1989 Royal Commission on the Wrongful Prosecution and Conviction of Donald Marshall Jr., a Mi'kmaq from Member 2 First Nation, Cape Breton, the son of a hereditary chief, who was wrongly charged, wrongly prosecuted, and wrongly convicted of murder in 1971. More than 3 decades later, we who are not Indigenous are still awakening from our self-induced slumber to see who and what has been buried, literally and figuratively, by the legacy and ongoing practices of settler colonialism. The recovery, rebuilding, and rearticulation of Indigenous law is one of Val Napoleon's many extraordinary contributions as an Indigenous activist, educator, scholar, and leader. Interim Dean, Professor Val Napoleon is a member of the Saulteaux First Nation and also an adopted member of the Gitano-Gitxsan House of Lujan, Canada, or Frog Clan. She has advocated, educated, and taught about Indigenous feminist legal studies, self-government, and restorative justice in a variety of contexts. She directs the Indigenous Law Research Unit, which she co-founded in 2012 to partner with Indigenous communities. She also co-founded, directs, and teaches in the Joint Degree Program in Canadian Common Law and Indigenous Legal Orders, the world's first Indigenous Law degree program, which is garnering well-deserved respect and attention around the world. In my view, this program is certainly the most momentous and ambitious achievement in legal education in Canada, ever. Professor Napoleon is the recipient of numerous awards and accolades for her many, many accomplishments. One of our colleagues, Professor Carrie Taylor, has participated in courses offered at University of Victoria in Indigenous legal orders. And I've asked her to join us in welcoming Professor Napoleon by sharing with us some of the insights and impacts of those learning experiences on her as individual and as teacher. I'll say this lecture is being recorded so that those who are unable to attend today can watch it on our website. After the lecture, we will take questions, and those of you who are watching, please feel free to write in your questions at any time during the lecture, as well as after, in the chat function on YouTube, and I will moderate. The Q&A part will not be recorded. And now I'd like to hand the microphone over to my colleague, Professor Carrie Taylor, who has provided a video recording because where she's coming from doesn't have stable Wi-Fi, but she's here with us today as well. So over to you, Professor Taylor.
Hello and good afternoon. Ani Bojo. I'm Carrie Taylor, Indigenous, Irish, Scottish, Dutch, Jaganash Kwe, and Dao. I'm a white settler of Irish, Scottish, Dutch descent. Lucia Nishnabe Odinong Ndonjaba. I live in Toronto. Marathon Nindinda. Presently, I'm visiting the place colonially known as Marathon, Ontario. It's the territory of the Bitagong Ojibwe, who belong to the Anishinaabe Confederacy of the Three Fires. As such, I've attempted to introduce myself in the language of these lands so that the ancestors might recognize our discussion today. I'm in Robinson Superior Treaty Territory, an ongoing agreement pertaining to approximately 640 kilometers along the shoreline of Lake Superior. Magnificent Lake Superior, Gitche Gaming. Professor Napoleon, it is my honor to welcome you to this virtual space of sharing today. To those viewing or listening, perhaps you might also want to pay tribute and express gratitude to the lands, territories, and Indigenous peoples where your feet are currently planted. You can do so within the chat. As Professor Macklin has said, we offer you, Professor Napoleon, a gift of Indigenous artwork created by Gaho Wageo, Bruno Henry, Cayuga, Six Nations of the Grand River. I'm so pleased to be able to both support him and share his vision and his work with you all today. He has taught me so much about patience, kindness, and unconditional love. In this welcome, I hope that you can come to know me and us by seeing some of yourself and your impact here at the center. We may not have spent much time in each other's company, but in so many ways we are connected. Gitchigaming, Lake Superior, the great water, has so many faces, so many moods. Locals and tourists travel down the quiet street where I'm staying every day to visit the lake and look at the pebble beach, to marvel, appreciate, talk with, question, and to reflect. Sometimes, of course, to eat a sandwich or have a cigarette or make a phone call. Gitchigaming wakes us up, rejuvenates us, astounds us, teaches us. Most importantly, gives and sustains life. I'm grateful to the water for providing a language of more complex seeing and for helping me to express the impacts of your methods, scholarships, and teachings. In my genealogy of knowledge, Professor Napoleon, you and your colleagues at the Indigenous Law Research Unit and University of Victoria Law School hold a place of great importance. I see you as a beginning, both for me and my students, and for that I thank you with all of my heart. Although we haven't really met on a personal level, I've felt and been propelled forward by the many waves and ripples of your pedagogy, methods, writings, and teachings. Without hyperbole, I can tell you that you have also given life to my students. When I began teaching at the center, I was blessed to begin to learn again, or perhaps in many ways to learn for the first time, since this learning happened with my body, spirit, and emotions, and led me towards ways and means of engagement with Indigenous peoples, legal traditions, and legal orders. So I headed off to Victoria to be a learner in your Indigenous Research Methods class, which, due to circumstance, you didn't teach. Your course was stewarded and co-taught by non-Indigenous faculty, Professor Rebecca Johnson, and a practitioner of Indigenous law, Alan Hanna, and their teamwork was marvelous. My first morning in class is such a fond memory. I entered a room with chairs in a circle, desks in pods, and craft paper on the walls, awaiting our collaboration and the sharing of our experiences and ideas. Minutes after class began, students kept getting up, slowly, quietly leaving the room. Was there great coffee or baked goods somewhere close by out there that I didn't know about? No, how could there be? We were pretty much in the middle of the bush, by Toronto standards anyway. So I was perplexed. I watched, I waited. It turns out what was happening, many insects of various shapes and sizes had been wandering in and wanted to check out the classroom. Perhaps they had something they wanted to say. Students were gently escorting them out back to a tree or a shady spot surrounded by plants. Interestingly to me, no one was visibly annoyed by this activity. The professors, the students, or the bugs. Was this for real? In a law school? I had entered a different kind of space, where learning was going to take place on a more interrelated scale and on more varied terrains than I had previously been able to imagine. We were becoming grounded, as Indigenous legal orders are grounded. The research methods to which I was introduced buttressed engagement between students of Canadian law and Indigenous law, between a spectrum of learners ranging from settlers to Indigenous folks, between academia and community. I was taught to never show up in community empty-handed and to always start by bringing culturally appropriate food. I wish we were able to share some food today. Also, not to presuppose or assume control of time frame or agenda. And importantly, to borrow a phrase I see being used by the University of Manitoba these days, it is pivotal to, quote, do the work before the work. Our entry point into preparing to draw out Indigenous law in a collaborative way with and in community was story. We analyzed and discussed public, published, written stories from a number of different peoples and communities. I was told these stories, Indigenous stories, one source of Indigenous law, are resilient. But these stories, I panicked. They aren't mine. Should I be casually or even recklessly swimming around within them? What if I do even more harm? Indigenous stories I came to see were a bit like a mirror on the surface of the water, reflecting my own assumptions back to me. They were also impervious to my lack of vision, to my own cultural, cosmological, epistemological, and ontological biases. Through discussion with my co-learners and the course facilitators, new depths, life worlds unknown to me, started to splash me and to exert a sharp tug. I was guided to sit with the stories as I often sit at the beach beside this lake. Waves keep coming and the water keeps moving. Just like this incredibly great lake, within Indigenous stories there are forces so much bigger than oneself. Some of them are so powerful that they ought not to be invoked by certain folks at certain times without certain capacities, wisdoms, and experiences. Like the lake, they command humility and respect. The method to which I was introduced was similar to a case analysis, with which I was familiar from law school, but there were some slightly different questions, and I paraphrase. Who is in relation, and how? What or whom is causing conflict? Who is acting? Who is deciding? What or whom is impacted, and how? And something that struck me as being so important was the question, what needs to be bracketed, so set aside and not interfered with? This bracketing was about not presuming to understand someone else's ways or traditions or beliefs when I didn't, just in order to produce an instrumental kind of answer or response. It was about not filling in the blanks without community consultation before relations of trust had been built. I saw a robust community-engaged research process with protocols anchored in Indigenous community control of both projects and results. Give and don't take, ebb and flow, high tide and low, reciprocity. I learned not to romanticize. The stories were filled with conflict, trickery, deception, thievery, and often violence. This reminds me of how the lake can appear so furious and very dangerous and even life-threatening, with waves rolling and churning and crashing. Yet still, the water at the bottom remains undisturbed. This lake is a being with so many layers. Underlying or underneath what I thought I could see and thought was going on in the stories, there was a kind of bedrock. The bedrock was a life world and its attendant ways of knowing and being. Ways of being based on grounded understandings of a good life. Mino bimatsuin, as it is said in this place. All the while, during my short learning stint at UVic, Professor Napoleon, I felt that I was swirling around as if in a whirlpool, flailing without being able to establish my bearings. To be so kindly and purposefully knocked off kilter, wow, what a gift. This is truly what I think learning ought to be about. To be introduced to a method that so wet the whistle of my curiosity and led me to engage that which I did not know that I even did not know. It was life-changing. I found in the Indigenous Research Methods course a quality of receptivity. Those who work within the Indigenous Law Research Unit create dialogue between peoples and bridges between legal systems and legal orders, all by employing shared modes of reasoning and familiar yet equivocal principles within their methods. I experienced how learning by oneself, or from a book, or in a classroom with no windows and no fresh air, and yes, even with no bugs, just doesn't cut it. To draw law from within a grounded legal order, one must open the floodgates of and to all relations. That summer, I was learning by depths and in leagues previously unimagined. There were, to quote Stalo author Lee Miracle, whole universes in those stories. Above all, I came to see the importance of engaging Indigenous law, here through story, using a methodological roadmap rooted in deep and immersive understandings of relational accountability. Relational accountability. Professor Napoleon, what stood out so clearly to me was how your course, particularly when co-taught the way it was, models the saying echoed by Indigenous folks the world over, quote, nothing about us without us. The integrity and transformative possibilities within this type of partnership, created and led by Indigenous peoples, yet welcoming of other collaborators, is something I am so honored to have witnessed, ever so briefly, from the inside. I speak on behalf of everyone at the Center when I express my gratitude for what you are about to share with us today. I know from experience that we will all be greatly enriched. Thank you, and until we meet again. Gichimigwech, Minwa, Bamapi, Gawapman.
Professor Napoleon, Carrie was right when she said she speaks for all of us with gratitude for what you are about to share with us. And so without further ado, I'm delighted to hand it over to you, Professor Napoleon.
Thank you. That was such a gift. There are things there that I'm going to take away. I'm going to take away the thinking about a story like the surface of the water and the different levels of water, and being able to see like the layers that we can learn through stories and the work that it enables us to do. That was just beautiful, extraordinary. I loved it. Thank you, Audrey, for the introduction as well. And I'm delighted to be here. And of course, I wish this was in person. But that's the way it is right now. I'm speaking to you from Victoria, which are the Lekwungen speaking people's lands, and their historic ties to these lands, they continue to today. They continue, and there are communities here that the Songhees and the Esquimalt and the Wasonic peoples continue to be a part of these lands that Victoria is is on today. So I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to share, and I will explain these parts of the PowerPoint. And here we go. See if I can do this without too much problem. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Yes? No? Okay, I'll assume that the PowerPoint is working. So the ravens I want to first introduce. These are ravens which I painted some years ago now, and ravens for some people are a trickster, and tricksters are the first law teachers, and she teaches us in many ways. She teaches us by slapping us upside the head, by gentle learning, by not so gentle learning, and so on. And so we've used these paintings in much of our work to draw out questions of law and ideas of law. So I offer them here. The other reason I'm showing them is because I heard a long time ago that we listen better if we have something to look at. So you'll see different ravens as part of the talk. And I'm trying to change screens. Okay. There we go. Okay. So this painting, it's one of my favorite images, and so I interpret this image as a conception of justice. And so this is my adaptation of Walter Benjamin's interpretation. And he is looking at the Angel of History painted by Paul Klee. And so here's the description as I've adapted it for this talk. The angels of history are moving away from something. They are staring, and their wings are spread. Before them, there are chains of events that are piling up at their feet, forming wreckages through time, of time. A storm is blowing through the different paradises, and it catches the angels' wings so they can no longer close them. The angels are facing the past, while the storm irresistibly propels them backwards into the future. The wreckage of all our times and that of earlier times are piling up as debris before the angels, growing skyward. Some people call this storm justice. So what I love is the fact that her hair is messy, she's imperfect, her wings are limited, and despite everything she endures. The other thing that I love is that she reminds me of Thompson Highway's book, which is titled Permanent Astonishment. And so this seems to capture some of what I think about when I hear the title Permanent Astonishment. The other conceptions of justice that are helpful to my talk are drawn from Jim Tully's most recent edited collection called Democratic Multiplicity. So it's the multiplicity that I really want to consider in this exploration of justice. So hence the title of my talk. There are 3 parts to my talk. So I want to look at just for a few minutes the different demands and expectations that are made in the name of justice. And second, I want to talk about Indigenous legal orders and laws and bring those into conversations with conceptions of justice. And my third section is to explore how does justice work when when law is non-state. So Indigenous peoples were non-state societies with law that operated. And so how do we understand justice in those societies historically? And the reason I'm looking at that conception is to think about the rebuilding of citizenries for Indigenous peoples, rebuilding our understanding of law founded on a different kind of conception of the person and the citizen. So I'll be drawing on my work that was so beautifully presented earlier by Carrie, my work with Indigenous law and also our Indigenous law degree program. And I really hope you have lots and lots of questions. So the first part of this talk, we all hear demands for justice from all corners of our societies, from our worlds. And they mean different things. They are often contradictory and they cross every political stripe. But to start with a lighter note, one of the most puzzling justice demands is a delightful food truck here in Victoria, and it's called Taco Justice. When I see this food truck, I consider various interpretations, and I think I've settled on doing justice to the taco. As you can tell, I really have no idea. I just like the name, Taco Justice. More seriously, we hear calls for vaccine justice from around the world. And the meaning here is for wealthier countries to share their vaccines with those that don't have them, who are poorer countries. Taking vaccine justice seriously is proposed as a way to move from thinking about health as a commodity to a public good. And you can see that the term justice is an integral part of how people are framing and conceiving these demands. Among the most disturbing demands for justice have been the various anti-vaccination demonstrations, including the popular truckers convoy and the encampments, the Freedom Convoy that headed to Ottawa and then set up that encampment. These are extreme polarized claims where on the one hand, vaccine justice is a call for the increasing availability of vaccine and the sharing of those with despite the political and economic disparities. While on the other hand, there's a call to end vaccination requirements and other health mandates. So all of these hold notions of justice, and they're founded on deeply held expectations for what that is. And none of this is a surprise to anybody who's listened to the news, even just a little bit in this last year. Justice is the conveyance for what we care about, whether we're concerned about penitentiaries, law enforcement, Indigenous land ownership, health, education, human rights, economic disparity, or climate change. Justice is a useful frame, and it's not always deployed in the most useful way. And some of the claims are, I think, suspect. I want to focus on one thread that runs through many of these protests and many of these claims. And this is the claims for freedom. There's a political philosopher who is called Michael Blake. And what he writes is that he is advocating for creating a world and a way of working together that has shared evidence. And from his position, he's arguing that when there is no shared standard for evidence, then the people who disagree with us, they're not making claims about something that we understand together, about something that has that shared evidence. What they're doing is something else. They're declaring a political allegiance or a moral worldview. in the absence of anything that's shared. So deliberately developing a shared standard of evidence requires that we first understand our own limitations. What don't we know? What is our understanding of justice and where does it come from? And what is the understanding of justice that's held by others? In his work with torture around the world, Ron Krenelson has argued that we behave in the world as we understand it to exist. So what do we believe about justice in our worlds? Jim Tully, leading political philosopher, he's written that freedom is a practice. It's a series of practices, and these are also practices of citizenship. So his frame of citizenship being created by people from the ground up, as opposed to being created from the top down by a state. So the kind of citizenship that he's speaking about is a relational construct with obligations. So all legal orders, including Indigenous legal orders, have obligations. And these legal orders create and they recognize and they vary and enforce obligations. It's obligations that are central to the social role of law, and being able to explain what those obligations are to each other, that shared evidence or shared understandings, that's necessary to understanding law's authority. This ground level of understanding is in contrast to the citizenship, again, being a top-down conception that captures people in the conception itself. So according to Tully, we are all within and a part of the relations of power that comprise our worlds, and no one exists outside of these relations of power. My colleagues and I have been working with Tully's practices of freedom, practices of citizenship, and we've created what is called the Tully wheel. And we use this wheel when working with students, when working in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, because it's a way of recognizing all of the different roles that people have. And it's a way of showing that there's no one way of working. We need all the different perspectives. And there are different points of entry into discussions with one another. So it's, I think, a critical way to think about civil society. It's a critical way to think about Indigenous societies and about what those practices of civility are, which are a part of Indigenous law, a part of Indigenous legal orders existing. If all we have are demands and expectations, then we can become paralyzed without a way forward. And sometimes what's happening is sometimes demands are made in the name of Indigenous law, but they're not necessarily shared, and there is no way that people can act on them. So I want to talk about that a little bit here. So these practices of freedom, practices of citizenship, it's one way to begin rebuilding law, Indigenous law. It's one way to begin taking up the important work of our citizenries. So these practices, you can see here, they're operating within the rules, or the relations of power. They're negotiating the rules, they're confronting the rules, or they're acting otherwise outside the relations of power. So our freedoms are relational, and they're defined by how our world is constructed and how we imagine our world. So the Tully wheel, the work of it, we first, we start with a big circle on the wall, and we ask people to think about all of the things that have been created in the relations of power, in terms like what are the oppressions and what are the different ways that these are experienced, and how are they manifested in the outside world. And the circle represents the community or the community of practice that the individuals are a part of. So what's going on in the world that we're concerned about? How does what's going on in the world become internalized within our communities? And how are these, you know, what, so it's putting names to all of the things that, you know, we think that is important that we try and work on. The second step is we take Tully's 4 practices of freedom and we put them up on the same wall where people have written their concerns. And those 4 practices, you know, are ways that people, despite everything, all of the oppressions that have continued all around the world and through history, despite everything that's gone on, people have continued. Indigenous peoples have persevered and have continued. And then looking at what is it that they're doing and how are they doing it, they can be captured, at least, you know, through this lens, through these 4 practices. So we put those up. And then the third step is we ask people to think about their own work, the different points of their work, the different, whether it's, and to think about their volunteer, what they do through the things that they care about in their communities. So these include all of the ways that people are engaged in what is going on around them. And we also then ask them to think about to where in this overall picture, how does what they're doing, how does it fit with the 4 practices that of freedom that are listed? So there, and we can start to see that there could be really efficient, effective social workers who are acting within the rules, and through that acting within the rules are able to change the lives of the people that they're working with. So she's acting within the rules, but in a way that enables change and help for the people that she's working with. Sometimes it is the case that rules are the only safe place. We can think about leaders who are negotiating the rules, and you can think about some of the recent child welfare agreements under Bill C-92, for example. There are amazing initiatives all over the country with, you know, you think about language programs or Indigenous schools or restoration of landscapes, protection of marine life and salmon and so on. So there's all those kinds of things. There are the different ways that people are confronting the rules, including litigation. And then there's acting otherwise, where people, you know, we've seen rooftop gardens, we've seen, you know, the activism around the first abortions, we've seen the historic small boys camp in the Rocky Mountains, where many Indigenous peoples went to escape the Indian Act, and the way that the Indian Act was being experienced as oppression. So this is a way for people to recognize what they're doing and to recognize what everybody else is doing against this whole background of what is going on in the world. It's another way to create conversations about what each other is doing, and finding ways to build that understanding. In one community, elders were delighted to find that the work that they were doing insofar as teaching their grandchildren to tan hides was recognized as strengthening the core of the community, that they were teaching their grandchildren the language and doing that. And they had never had that recognition for what it was that they were doing before. And so it was a fabulous way for others to see the importance of their work and them to also be recognized in that way. It's all of these are they're interrelated. There's not one way, you can't just do confrontation. You're going to end up linking and working with other practices all at once. So, there's, but when we think about this as a way to try and create these multiple perspectives of one another, it becomes an important way to deal with some of the conflicts. Many of our Indigenous communities are very conflicted, and this is a way to help bridge some of those conflicts so that people aren't disregarded depending on where they are in these practices of freedom. So another aspect of this is, and it's a later step, is that then you can start asking whether and how the work being done in these different parts of the tully wheel, does it change the oppression, or does it perpetuate it? So this can also become a terms of measure. Care has to be taken in how to do that so that we don't just begin creating more divisions than there already are in our communities. What's really important is that wherever we are in the relations of power, again, that we are always a part of, we have obligations to not perpetuate oppression, whether we're a social worker or a prison guard or a law professor or whoever. So when we think about the calls of justice, it's about rebuilding civil society. And this is one way to begin building, I think, something that is like collaborative justice, that shared sense of justice. So moving to the second part of my talk, we have the amazing formerly Justice Murray Sinclair, now Senator and Chancellor Sinclair. During the Manitoba Justice Inquiry, he was making the case that there's different ways that justice looks very different, whether you come from an Indigenous society or you come from the dominant society. And he posed those differences in terms of how punishment was viewed and the purposes of punishment. So that, as he was saying, that there are very different ways of dealing with those that cause harms and injuries. And those very different ways represent a different way of understanding justice. So I usually resist dichotomies because they really flatten the space that's necessary for critical conversations. But this differing perspective, depending on the experiences and history and who people are, is important. What ends up happening, though, is that when justice is talked about, it's usually, for when Indigenous peoples are a part of that, it's usually talked about as the various ways, some of them terrible, that the state and the law enforcement, the Canadian legal system, the ways that Indigenous peoples have been failed. So the focus is quite often on incarceration, on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, which we saw the inquiry for, on health and drinking water, on the unmarked graves, the Wet'suwet'en protests, and on and on. So there's all of those really important struggles and issues. And the focus is on the state's role in those issues. And in BC, we have newly established Indigenous justice centers that deal with legal aid and child welfare, restorative justice. There's a range of things with Gladue and so on. What I want to do is take a different approach and begin asking, how does justice look if we look at it from inside an Indigenous legal order, from an Indigenous legal perspective? So Senator Sinclair said, and others have said this too, that no society can exist without law. You know, he talks about where that comes from and why it's important to a society. So, you know, we know that Indigenous law hasn't gone anywhere in Canada. We also know that Indigenous law has been undermined, it's been distorted, and there are gaps. And we're not in a situation where there's complete intact legal orders that are going to spring to life through mere recognition. And we have to think about that especially when there's so many demands being made about Indigenous law. So my perspective, law is a distinct mode of governance. And you can't be a people without law. Indigenous law is not just philosophy, it's not just ceremony, it's not just rules to be followed, and it's not stuck in the past. So it does include philosophy, it does include ceremony, and it does include rules. But we have to have a much thicker conception of what law is. So we know that Canadian conceptions of justice are varied, and there's contestation. And this is the same for Indigenous peoples. There's justice and law is not something that you arrive at, that it provides answers. It's something that grows out of people solving problems, living their lives, and working collaboratively toward the aspirations that people share. So this, the aspirations of justice and law, is on a case-by-case basis, on a problem-by-problem basis, as well as having that overall idea of where things are going. To do this work, I'm drawing on, for this, this part of the talk, drawing on the work of Angela Cameron in her work with sexual assault. And she says you need three things to properly be able to engage and take up the issues. You need specificity, you need inclusivity, and nuance. And so we're going to go so specificity. We have to, whenever possible, ask which legal order we're thinking about when we're talking about Indigenous law. Is it Gitxsan? Is it Tsimshian? Is it Tsilhqot'in? Secwepemc, Dene, Daneza. So there's, every legal order has a full scope of law, which enables it to deal with all of the messiness of human beings living together, collective human life. So it includes governance, it includes family, it includes lands and water and human rights and economies and so on. It has a full scope of law historically. Then it's about asking, what is the legal issue that's being focused on? And from this legal perspective, is it a land conflict? Is it trespass? Is it succession? Is it water management, or a family problem, or human rights? And then who are the authoritative decision makers? And what are the legal institutions through which that law operates? think of clans or families or other ways that people have other societal structures. So when we think about authoritative decision makers, pretty well every group every society that we've worked with across Canada has at least 4 decision-making groups. And for Cree, just as an example, there's family members, there's medicine people, there's elders, and there's the community group itself. And which group becomes involved with a legal problem depends on what that legal problem is. And then there are the legitimate processes for determining responses. So they're guided by principles, which are also part of the legal order, fairness and inclusion. And the steps include consultation and information gathering. So there are legal processes for all aspects of the operation of law. And when thinking about responses, ways that law will respond to the different kinds of challenges that human beings are grappling with, there's a range of remedies. And I'll give a Cree example of this in just a minute. There are sanctions. There's going to be precedent, which is the stories and narratives and oral histories that Carrie referred to earlier. And there's also often more than one Indigenous people that are involved, and that requires additional understanding of, what legal order is involved here, what's the legal histories, what are the legal resources, and so on. So there's homework. I'm setting this out because it's important not to conflate Indigenous legal processes. It's important not to just say that this is the law and to think that that is going to provide you with the answers. There has to be an application, a sorting out, looking at the different interpretations and the different experiences of the people who are involved with that legal order. So declarations about what the law is, as if that's an answer, is an incomplete process. Inclusion, the aspirations of inclusion and fairness and dignity, and these are aspirations of law that were a part of and are a part of every legal order that we've looked at. And this is about stopping and not assuming that our first engagement with Indigenous law is somehow complete and that you see all of the answers. There are power dynamics. Indigenous law, just the same as any other law, is constituted by and constituting of the power dynamics around it. And so what are those relations of power? Whose voices are heard? Who's invisible, and what exactly are the conflicts that are going on? So, in our work, we've been working with some folks on the articulation of human rights from an Indigenous legal perspective. So, notions of dignity and agency and so on from within a legal order. And gender, it comes up in every single project, in every single community event, workshops, and so on. But it's also still the hardest one to deal with. And there's every form of resistance that comes up that still have to be dealt with. And Indigenous women in some places have asked for separate workshops, or there have been separate spaces. So it's, there continue to be, safety and violence are matters of Indigenous law, and they continue to be challenges in different places, many places. Nuance, again, as I said earlier, the kind of legal problems that people have, it depends on that will determine who the decision makers are. And Cree elders, for instance, can either be persuasive or directional, and it depends on whether there's community safety at risk, and just what is going on with the problems. So, the questions, throughout all of these processes and the solving of problems, they create understandings of justice. And I want to take this to looking at how this works, or how it could work, just to give you a really good example. And so I wrote a paper on Gitxsan legal personalities, and I focused on the legal personalities of women and how Gitxsan law creates that. And I know this is legal personalities is a contested area, but this is an important way to look at how are women a part of that legal order? What can she expect? And I know this is very heteronormative, and this is the state of law as it's currently articulated. It doesn't mean that it shouldn't change, or that there doesn't mean that there aren't Gitxsan LGBTQ communities. This articulation, though, is still heteronormative. So a Gitxsan woman, for the law that is a part of her life and that she is a part of, she would form and be responsible for a kinship unit, and she'd be responsible for the governance of that, including possible leadership. She would be a part of collective ownership of territories with her sisters, her children. She's legally and politically defined by the same owned oral histories. She is one of the owners of those oral histories. She's entitled to the same privileges and prerogatives as in her kinship group. And she's subject to her kinship group's obligations and liabilities. Historically, she would have had a separate economic life, because she would marry someone from another clan who would have separate territories. And so there's, overlapping and collective concerns for in a couple, but she still has an aspect of her economic life which is separate. Historically, they were arranged marriages, and had more to do with alliances rather than romantic love. And land, she and her children would have access to land that her kinship group owns, but there were other lands also that would be available to her. And there are legal obligations that she has, that she owes, and that others owe to her. So for a Gitxsan woman, from this legal perspective, what would justice mean? It would mean being able to rely on these aspects of Gitxsan law in the management of disputes or concerns that she would have about her life or the life of her children, whether it had to do with the marriage itself, whether it had to do with housing, and so on. So this is a conception of justice which is quite different for different reasons from common law, from justice that's created from a common law perspective or that state perspective. So the scope of arguments that she would have for substantive and procedural law would be reflective of this. The other piece of this is that she has legal agency, both as an individual, but also as collective agent, as part of her kinship unit. And she, in this non-state society, would be responsible for the law in collaboration with others in the society. I just want to introduce this, which is looking at many of the ways that sexism is a part of Indigenous communities and everywhere else too. And for Indigenous women, we have, one end of the spectrum with the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, including women from my family, women from, the Gitxsan society. And so, but there's this whole range of the ways that sexism manifests in women's lives. So there's the one extreme, but there's also the everyday consequences of romanticism and stereotypes about Indigenous women, talking about Indigenous women solely as mothers, for instance. And these are created by everyday decisions that have material consequences on women. There's Indigenous male privilege, for instance, which has consequences on all of women's lives as well. So in talking about Gitxsan law and women in Gitxsan law, this is also a part of what has to be dealt with, not just for Gitxsan, but for other societies as well. And I'm just looking at the time, and I'm at the end of my time. And I think I'll just say a couple of things here. I think that we need to better understand how a non-state legal order and a non-state society, what does that mean for the individuals who are part of that society, insofar as the responsibility for and the engagement with law in terms of determining what it is, whether it's been broken, and whether it needs to be changed. So that understanding of law and that which emanates from law is very different when there's not a centralized state with emanations of justice responsibilities coming from it, with ministries and law enforcement and the different parts of the state. There's no delegated group of people responsible for the law. There's no bureaucracy that holds the law, but rather it's just the authorities and the responsibilities for it are distributed throughout the institutions and individuals of that society. So this, part of the reason I think that this is so critical for Indigenous societies is that we need to start thinking about how is Indigenous law internalized? Like how do Indigenous peoples understand that as creating meaning, as creating norms and so on? Because one of the destructive aspects of colonization has been that redefining of law in often very thin or very narrow ways. So that is an important piece of future work, along with a lot of other work that I think that we need to take up as much as we can. I really hope you have some questions. I'm going to stop sharing and how do I do that? Sorry. Okay. There.
Professor Napoleon, thank you. That was an extraordinarily rich and thought-provoking presentation. And at one level, I have dozens of questions. And another level, I actually kind of want to sit with it and just reflect and not rush thoughts about it. And that must be a sign of a really profoundly affecting presentation. So I want to begin by thanking you. I also want to ensure that people can open it up for questions, and I would encourage all of you to put questions in the chat, and I will happily moderate that. I'm looking now in the chat, and I'm not sure I'm seeing anything, and I'm not sure if that's a technical problem. But if it is, and I'm not able to see questions in the chat, what I'd like to do is just maybe start, as I said, up here, I see a question. Let me begin, actually, from Mariana Valverde. I see questions coming up. Mariana says, I have been deeply inspired by notions and practices of justice developed by Indigenous leaders, and also by critical settler thinkers from Walter Benjamin to Jim Tully. However, I wonder about the term freedom. It seems to have been so tied to individual liberty and individual property and denial of community needs that I have trouble thinking about whether practices of freedom can be recuperated and freed from its liberal individualist context.
There are so many things that are difficult to dislodge from their historic moorings. I share your concern, and part of what I think is important from my perspective is to emphasize the relational aspect of agency, of autonomy, and of freedom, and so that there's another way of understanding and interpretation that is strong enough to withstand that individualization of that notion of freedom. I think the individual notion of freedom has done great damage to how we understand ourselves as people, how we understand ourselves as responsible for not just ourselves, but for the people around us. I think there's a similar kind of issue that's raised by the language of nation. I think that the term nation, which is now applied to small communities rather than societies, or thinking about law on a legal order basis, that things like self-government and law is thought about on a very small, fragmented basis. The other piece of that is that then the responsibilities that small groups of people have to each other aren't necessarily acted on, and that what's defined is that small communities as independent, if they're called a nation. And if you look at the operation of law between small groups, small societies, historically, from a Gitxsan perspective or Cree perspective, the obligations that mattered were horizontal. They weren't vertical with the state. And so that idea of interiority of law, rebuilding collectivity of law, and redefining those key kind of aspects. I think that's the work of law. That's the work to take up, is taking those challenges on and thinking them through and trying to find better ways to understand ourselves.
Thank you. I have a question from John Johnson, who says, beautiful talk. Thanks so much. Can you speak of Canada's obligation to recognize and make space for the articulation and practice of legal orders of sovereign Indigenous, and here he uses the word nations, but I'm sure he would want to qualify that in the way you just described.
Okay. So I think that Canada is a multi-juridical place. The extent to which that multi-juridical state is acted on is oftentimes in question. I think that there are still much resistance to thinking about Indigenous law as law and about actually making real space for it. I think that what can end up happening in the name of recognition is that Indigenous law is given lip service, and it's not. It's talked about in very simple terms and is reduced to something like cultural practices, and that worries me. Which is why in my talk, what I was saying, that you have to think about what the legal issues are from an Indigenous legal perspective. So whether it's harms and injuries, whether it's lands, whether it's child welfare or whatever, and then you start the work of legal analysis and calling on precedents and all of the critical work that needs to go into it. But it has to be as a real engagement with law, and that means being specific and doing the homework. The thing is, like, people can often throw up their hands and just say, oh God, it's too complicated, it's too many legal orders, it's too hard. We're doing this work now. We've been doing this work for years at this point. Communities that we've been working with have articulated areas of law question by question for their work, and they use that in lots of different ways, including reestablishing, framing relationships with the state. So I think I'm really glad of your question, because it means that there's openness and so on. And I think that I think that there's some work to get over, like, because sometimes the resistance that we see is when people say it's just too difficult, can't do it. And it's not. We're doing it now. Indigenous communities are doing it now, and we'll keep doing it.
Thank you. Beth Totis has a question, and she thanks you for your talk. She asks, do you feel that the new UNDRIP laws in Canada will truly benefit Indigenous peoples?
I think that it creates, what it has done is create some useful sites of conversation. Again, it's if the people's expectations have to be unpacked. Like, so. I think that it's a useful frame, and there's all kinds of work that peoples are doing that can be supported by that. It in and of itself, the recognition of Indigenous law through UNDRIP or through any other means isn't what creates the validity of Indigenous law. Like, the work has to go on from by Indigenous peoples. And that's, the other thing that I referred to is when we talk about Indigenous law and when we make expectations or demands of Indigenous law to be a part of all of the different things we want it to be a part of, we also have to remember that rebuilding Indigenous legal orders requires that Indigenous communities be supported to do that. It's a huge amount of work for communities to take on. And so, like, the way that the Indigenous Law Research Unit works is by invitation. Communities, groups come and say, this is something we want to research in our law. This is what we need, this area of law articulated, and so we work with them for about 2 years, drawing on the narratives, drawing on the oral histories, doing collaborative interviews, workshops, and we are set out a report for them from their law about that question. So, and you can go to our website and see examples of some of that work. So it's that, you know, if UNDRIP, you know, does nothing else except create ways to support Indigenous communities to take up the work that's done, you know, that's the first step then to changing the kinds of conversations that should go on with between Indigenous peoples and with Canada. Like, so right now, notions like reconciliation and so on, if Indigenous peoples haven't been able to do the rebuilding that's necessary for their legal orders, then what's being talked about is Canadian law, and that's the template. That's the way that the conversation is funneled, is through the various shapes and forms of Canadian law. And you know, if that doesn't change much, so you know, there's more, the harder work remains. So
Thank you. I have a question from Sabine Kazmi. And we're getting lots of questions, so I hope everyone is okay if I kind of distill questions as much as I can here. It's about positionality while working in a colonial institution that fails to understand or recognize your worldviews, and how you overcome these barriers in very concrete ways with respect to things like publications and jobs and so on. I hope I've captured that correctly.
okay, yeah. So, you know, when I first started as a law professor, I used to have to argue that Indigenous peoples had law, and you know, I know that some of those arguments still have to go on, but the conversations have largely changed to how Indigenous law works, and it's not the same kind of resistance to Indigenous peoples being a people or being real somehow. So that trying to you know, in work in the institutions that we're a part of, in ways that fully allow us to act on in ways that make sense for the work that Indigenous peoples need, you know, that's, I think, going to continue to be a struggle. Like, so, because it's easier, you know, John Burroughs has a saying, he says, what people, if not Indigenous people, love about Indigenous peoples is that which is beautiful. And they don't like that part, those parts of us that are complicated and troublesome and so on. And sometimes I feel like that's what institutions do. They just they want to talk about things that they see are legitimate, like language, which is important, or land acknowledgements, which is important, but they don't want to talk about you know, the kinds of things that I think is important, or you know, real Indigenous law and real complicated issues like that there are many complex issues that have to be worked out. So it's just, I think it's that the work requires continued optimism. That sounds so trite, and I apologize. I just there have been changes, and sometimes we need humor, and sometimes we need art, and sometimes we need all these different ways to make things clear. And I really mangled that question, or that response. Sorry.
Have questions. They are. I want to say that many people have commented on how much they love the paintings, the ravens in particular. And one of the questions that came through that was, when talking about how colonization has the effect of constraining what we understand as law. Do you think about or is there space that you think about in terms of law as music or sound, or music and sound or art as law? I'm sorry if I've messed up that question to whoever posed it. I hope I've gotten the gist of it.
I think that if we if we develop a thick understanding of law and a critical understanding of law, the different expressions of law are include. There's many things. So there's performance. So like for Giksan, there's the songs. There's the different ways that those songs are, and then the names and the different aspects of oral histories and the crests and so on. They structure governance, right? So you can look and you can see and hear law. You have to have the ability to the framework through which that will happen. But there's art, I think, is really critical to it's an important way to deal with contradictions. It's an important way to deal with gaps. And pain and life and joy and all of these other things. So it forces us to think beyond, the narrow way of, what law is as being rules. And if we can understand law as, in a much more democratic, intensely democratic way, as Boaventura de Sousa Santos would say, then we have to see it in people's lives. We have to see it in the way that people create meaning in their lives. It becomes one of the ways that we understand the world. It becomes one of the ways that we manage and govern our behaviors, individually and collectively. The two are a necessary part of that. So in answer to the question, absolutely. But again, we need that framework, right? We need, because it's all of it which will enable us to hold each other accountable.
Thank you. Let me say, I have about 4 more questions here, and I know we're running short on time. I know that Professor Napoleon graciously agreed to continue answering questions. And so what I'm hoping is that we will round out the questions that are now posted. And that may take us a little bit past 1:30, but I hope everyone is okay with that. So our next question is from Jackie Briggs, who's thanking you and wondering, for settler persons just starting out as students or teachers, what do you think would be a first step you would recommend to start a learning journey?
Oh, lovely. So I think that there's so many ways that to start. I think that if you're taking, if law is a part of that, it's important to look at how you understand law and what it is and its history, and then, like, as a human, collective human enterprise. So, like, what is it? Like, what makes law? What are the, those kinds of questions, which I think that all of us need to have. And then, because the way that you understand law, as in your own world, your own society, that's your grid of intelligibility that you're going to apply to Indigenous law. And so you need to know what it is. Your grid of intelligibility is going to make some things visible and some things invisible, depending on what you think law is. So the learning journey, that's one place to start. Another place is to learn like the legal order in your area. And sometimes, because of recent history and and because of the way human beings are, it's more complicated. So in my community, we moved into Danisa territory where, I'm Cree, and we came across Canada beginning in the 1750s. So there's a Danisa legal order, there's Cree, not so much Soto left, and there's not so much Mohawk left. But so it isn't, there aren't, like our histories, our legal histories have caused changes that we need to understand. And so just looking at who are the people around and what are their histories, I mean, that's a starting place. I think that there's beginning to be some fantastic books that like I use, for instance, I teach Gitxsan land and property law. I use Neil Starrett's Mapping My Way Home, but there's fantastic Danisa books, there's Wet'suwet'en books that provide an amazing starting place for just, because part of it is you need to understand enough about the society whose law you want to learn about so that you can see the logics of that law in that society. What are the interpretive patterns, that are going to be applied? And anyway, it's you'll have an amazing journey. I'm glad you're taking it.
Thank you. From Adina Radosh, the question is about rights and obligations. So we think of rights as a Western settler way of thinking about relationality, and other systems might focus on obligations to kin and other rather than rights. And so the question she poses is, what are the implications of basing a legal order on obligations rather than rights?
So I'm not so concerned about the language of rights as some are. There's one of my favorite book titles is If God Were a Human Rights Activist by Boaventura de Sousa Santos. And he takes up the contestation around the language of rights that I think is useful. I think that whatever we call it, there has to be a way of understanding what people can expect from one another. And the language of rights is pretty universal, and in lots of situations is helpful for Indigenous peoples. So two things. I think that we have to take care in not create a dichotomy of rights versus no rights for Indigenous peoples. It's not. I think it's a more complex conversation than that would allow. So, and I worry sometimes about the way people talk about Indigenous law, that they're actually not talking about law, they're talking about a different way of, they're talking about a political ordering, but it's not law anymore, it's about behavior. And so the more complexity we can have, the better. And we really need to push ourselves on that. The other thing is that we have to be clear, like when we're talking about rights, like in which legal order. Like sometimes what people will do is talk about Indigenous law, but then talk about rights within Canadian law. And sometimes they're kind of murky in terms of how that's done. And it's just paying attention to how we're locating our expectations. And when we talk about law, like which law is it? So just being careful to differentiate.
Thank you. Mary Mitchell has a question about the layering of non-state Indigenous legal orders within settler colonies, using things like jurisdiction and formal and pluralism, and wondering if you had thoughts about how such orders might unbind or reach out to permeate more aspects of life and legal ordering beyond the jurisdictional boundaries imposed on them.
So I think, first of all, that if Indigenous peoples are supported to do the kinds of rebuilding that we need to do, that in and of itself will change the conversations with, the state. If we don't do that rebuilding, it ends up Indigenous peoples being in a deficit, right, which causes all kinds of problems. This idea that there's a deficit insofar as Indigenous peoples. So that is essential. And I think that, Indigenous communities, for the most, they're pragmatic, so, you can look at the Cowichan tribes, for instance, who are using the work that their own laws to develop management systems to protect the Cowichan River and the fish in that river. And so the Cowichan peoples have been doing that in a way that goes past, the various provincial or other kinds of regulatory frameworks about protecting the salmon. And you see other, so we've worked with 3-4 areas now of BC where there's water scarcity and where people are having to make the hard decisions, like the fires caused this huge conflict in one of the communities that we're working with, where there's the fish, the kokanee needed water and the fires needed water, and there wasn't much water. And how do you make the decision about where to put the water that you have? So people are having to make very practical decisions, and they're working those through in the best way that they can. So, I think that being able to approach the issues engaged in something like, in this case, water or salmon or whatever, it's not an academic argument about jurisdiction. It's people doing the work, taking the responsibility, acting on it, and then from that basis of strength, pushing back those limitations that are imposed.
Thank you. I think in your answer to that question, you might also have answered this one, but I'll pose it in case you have anything to add, which is about the possibility of community structures that give agency to alternative legal perspectives that can reconcile the needs of those affected by injustices. It seems to me the example you gave might have been partly, in the sense, an answer to that query, but I'll leave it to you.
Yeah, I think what I want to emphasize is that there's much critical thinking that has to go on with Indigenous law. And I'll just give you a tiny example. So Sally Engel Mary's done she did this amazing work with looking at how women around the world were experiencing violence, sexual violence, and so on. And what she said is that if women didn't feel recognized or that their problems mattered to the legal institutions in their lives, they wouldn't go to those institutions for help. They wouldn't recognize themselves as rights bearing insofar as the world around them. So here's the thing: when we're rebuilding Indigenous institutions, we have to make sure that they're capable of, recognizing women and girls and other vulnerable people in the society, so that we don't end up either perpetuating past oppressions or creating new oppressions. So insofar as our communities, these are going to be ongoing critical questions about are we perpetuating oppressions through our relations of power? Like, we have to make explicit what the dynamics of power are in order that they be dealt with. And so I'm talking about from an Indigenous perspective. I mean, it's important for everybody, but that's a starting place.
Thank you. I think I can build to another question based on what you said with respect to Sally Engel Mary's work on women. And the question from Wumi is about the ways in which the common law, which I take to be settler law, has eroded the Indigenous conception of justice for the Gitxsan women that you described in your presentation. I guess what the impact, if any has been on an internal conception of justice for women?
I think that there has been an undermining of Gitxsan women as legal agents in the fullest sense of the term, insofar as how historic Gitxsan law operated. I think that there's lots of reasons for that, including the shifting away from the horizontal systems of accountability to vertical, to the state mattering to small geographically pinned groups. So Gitxsan women, I mentioned, are also suffering from the whole missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and the violence in their lives. That is a part of, that's exactly why Indigenous law matters. Where we have the undermining of Indigenous law and where Canadian law has failed, those have created spaces of lawlessness, and violence happens in those spaces. So the Gitxsan women that we've been talking to, have been about doing that rebuilding, about finding ways to re-articulate their legal agency individually and collectively in that society. This is work not just for Gitxsan women, it's work for Cree women, it's Dene and so on. This is a part of rebuilding law. It's a part of rebuilding citizenry, is doing that in a way that takes on the uncomfortable questions, and we've got to be fearless in doing it.
I think fearless is a good way to close this by acknowledging your fearlessness and your wisdom, and really the kindness with which you have also pursued these questions, and the generosity of spirit. And I am, I know, channeling the gratitude of this audience and words like beautiful and powerful and deep that I have seen coming up in the chat to describe what your presentation has meant for them, and for all of us. Let me say, one of many things I take away from this is also not just about the relationship of law to justice, but the relationship of being able to claim, reclaim, name, articulate law itself as a dimension of justice, and how, in a sense, how vital that is in the constitution of people and ways of living and being and knowing. So let me close by saying, it takes the work of many people to put together the Edwards Lecture every year. And it is in the service of being able to really experience the gift that you have brought to us. I want to thank Yunalyn Lazado, Zora Anaya, Fernando Avila for all their work in bringing you to us. And also Carrie Taylor for her profound and moving, really, her way of sharing with us if I can say, drawing on the water metaphors, the ripple effects, that the impact of what she has learned from you, through you, at the center that you have created, directed, and know that how she has brought it to us at the center, to students, as part of our obligations to, and our commitments to learn, to know, and to do better. So Professor Napoleon, your lecture was a gift to us. We offer a small gift by way of thanks. And as Carrie described, this is the creation of Bruno Henry, who, and you can see here a brief description of his work and of him. And we'll be sending this on to you right away. I'm sorry we can't give it to you in person, and we can't reciprocate fully but we offer this to you as a gesture of thanks and appreciation. And with that, I want to ask everybody to join in me in thanking Professor Napoleon for not just a lecture that taught us new things, but I think one that opened up hearts and minds and a sense of not just rights, but obligations. So thank you so much. And everybody here, I'm just getting to all these comments, really affirming how amazing this has been. So thank you very much. And I wish you, and I wish everybody on the call a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you. This has been amazing. Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.